Hi everyone. Today I'm going to be discussing classical and operant conditioning and how these two theories can be used in teaching and learning. These are arguably two of the most important concepts in EdPsych when it comes to understanding how people learn and how their behavior is shaped. We see both types of conditioning in our everyday lives without even knowing that we're seeing it. So first, I want to just start by discussing what does learning mean? What is learning? To start, psychologists believe that learning is a long-term change in behavior that is based on experience. This means that learning is not just memorizing information, but it actually develops new skills, behaviors, and ways of thinking over time. Psychologists today study learning to better understand how people change and how we as teachers can support that process, especially in schools. There are two different types of learning that we're going to be focusing on today, and that is classical and operant conditioning. So before we dive into the different types of conditioning, I just want to take a look at what conditioning actually is. So conditioning is the process where we learn by forming associations between events or behaviors, and this is called stimuli. While classical conditioning and operant conditioning have their differences, they can both be used to help us explain how behavior is learned. So let's take a look at classical conditioning first. What is classical conditioning? Classical conditioning is the type of learning that happens through associations between stimuli. It involves behaviors that we can't control. These are called involuntary responses, and learned behaviors, and these are called conditioned responses. And this theory was first discovered by Ivan Pavlov in a series of experiments on dogs. Before we dive into Pavlov's experiments, I just wanted to go over a couple key terms so that we can better understand his experiment. So we have first off the unconditioned stimulus, which is something that causes a natural response. Then we have the unconditioned response, like we discussed earlier. This is a natural reaction to the unconditioned stimulus. We have the neutral response, or the neutral stimulus, excuse me. And then we have a conditioned stimulus. So the conditioned stimulus is something that was originally a neutral stimulus, but then it became associated with that unconditioned response. And then finally we have the conditioned response, because this is a learned reaction to the conditioned stimuli. Okay, so now that we understand some of the different terms that he uses, we can actually get into Pavlov's experiment. Originally, Pavlov was studying the digestion of dogs, and then he noticed something interesting. So he noticed that dogs would salivate when the person who brings them their food was nearby, even if they didn't have food. So at the beginning of the experiment, he used the food as the unconditioned stimulus because it was naturally and automatically happening, right, that the dogs would salivate. The salivation itself was the unconditioned response because the dogs didn't have to learn how to salivate when there was food present. So then he introduced a bell. At first, the bell did not cause a reaction in the dogs, so he called it a neutral stimulus. Then Pavlov would ring the bell before he gave the dogs any food. After repeating this many times, the dogs became associated. The dogs began to associate the bell with the food. Eventually, the bell alone would cause the dogs to salivate even if there was not food present. And because of this, we can call the bell a conditioned stimulus because it now has a triggered learned response. The salivation in response to hearing the bell became the conditioned response. As you can see on my little chart that I have here, this is pre-conditioning. The dog just hears the bell and doesn't think anything of it. So the bell is a neutral stimulus in that situation. And then he sees food and salivation occurs. Then during the conditioning, the dog hears the bell and he gets food at the same time and salivation occurs. And then at the very end, the dog hears the bell, salivation occurs because he thinks that he's going to get food, which is why hearing the bell became the conditioned response. So in addition to classical conditioning, we have extinction. This is another extension of classical conditioning. Extinction happens when the conditioned stimulus is repeatedly present without the unconditioned stimulus, and the learned response gradually disappears. In this case of Pavlov, if he continually rang the bell without bringing the dogs the food, then they would eventually stop salivating. And it's important to note that the extinction is not always bad, and it can be used as a tool to help people overcome fears. So an example of this might look like in the classroom, if a student is afraid to speak in class, but repeatedly has a positive or neutral experience when they speak, that fear can decrease over time. Even after extinction occurs, the learned behavior is not always completely gone. So this is where something called spontaneous recovery comes into play. Spontaneous recovery is when a previously extinct response suddenly reappears after time. So an example of this might be a student who finally overcame the fear of talking in the classroom, and then they suddenly become nervous again after a long period of time of not being nervous. This just shows that learning is never completely gone, but rather just suppressed. So as teachers, we have to remember that setbacks are normal, and they are a part of learning and changing behavior. Okay, so let's talk about contiguity and contingency in classical conditioning. So contiguity is a reference to how close in time two stimuli occur. For the learning to happen effectively, the conditioned stimulus, like the bell, needs to be introduced and presented very close in time with the unconditioned stimulus, the food, to form an association. So if too much time has passed between them, then that association is too weak and it might not even form at all. So that brings us to contingency, which is how reliable a stimulus predicts a different one. So in Pavlov's experiments, the bell consistently predicted the arrival of food because the bell was a reliable signal, and then the dogs were able to form an association between the two. Two other important processes, I believe, that are important processes in classical conditioning are called generalization and discrimination. Generalization happens when a learned response occurs to a stimuli that is like the original conditioned stimulus, but it's not the same. So I have down here on this picture, I have a bell, and in generalization, they would associate the bell and the honking of this horn together, and that would make it a generalization. So in the school, this might look like something like a student who is nervous to take tests, but is also nervous for anything related to school. And then I have discrimination here, and that's on the opposite side of the spectrum. So this is when a person learns to respond to only one specific stimulus, but not to others. So an example of this might look like a student who's nervous only about math tests, but isn't nervous about reading or science tests. And in this, I have just the bell being a stimulus, just the bell, because they don't associate, like in the experiment with the dogs, they wouldn't associate the bell and the horn together if it was a discrimination. So in teaching, let's look at how classical conditioning applies to the classroom. It's an important tool because it affects how students feel about learning. Teachers can create positive associations by making the classroom a safe and welcoming place. For example, they can use consistent routines, they can play calming music, they can greet students warmly at the door every day, and this helps students feel more comfortable and ready to learn in the classroom. But on the other hand, negative experiences with the teacher or the learning environment can lead students to having anxiety or fear in the classroom, which also can impact their learning, but just in a negative way. So now that we've looked into classical conditioning, let's switch over to the different type, which is called operant conditioning. So instead of focusing on associations between stimuli, operant conditioning focuses on how behavior is influenced by consequences. This theory was developed by B.F. Skinner, and the main idea of operant conditioning is that behaviors followed by positive outcomes are more likely to be repeated, while behaviors followed by negative outcomes are less likely to be repeated. In operant conditioning, there are two main concepts: reinforcement and punishment. Reinforcement is anything that increases the probability that a behavior will happen again. This means that a behavior that is followed by a positive outcome is then likely to occur again. When punishment is anything that decreases the likelihood a behavior will occur again. So if a behavior is followed by something that is unpleasant or results in losing something that they like, then that behavior is less likely to occur again. There are two types of reinforcement. We have positive reinforcement, which means adding something desirable like a reward to increase behavior. So on this page here, I actually have some stickers that a student might get as positive reinforcement. In a school, this might look something like getting a sticker for completing their work, and that makes them more likely to complete their work again. Negative reinforcement means removing something unpleasant to increase behavior, like canceling homework when the class behaves well for a substitute. Not that I actually think that would ever really happen, but still. Along with reinforcement, we also have two types of punishment. So positive punishment involves adding a consequence like giving extra work when a student misbehaves. And negative punishment involves taking something away, like losing recess or privileges. Both are meant to decrease the unwanted behavior. Here is a little chart and it explains operant conditioning. So in this blue section, we have positive reinforcement. So the dog was asked to sit and he gets a reward because he did so. And then if we go down to the yellow, we have negative reinforcement, which is removing something that was unpleasant. So in this case, the dog has the leash on and he did well walking with the owner, so he gets the leash loosened or even removed. On the red, we have positive punishment. This is adding something unpleasant. So this dog did something naughty and he got yelled at or told no. And down on this light blue section, we have negative punishment, which is removing something that is pleasant. So the dog was asked to sit. He didn't listen right away. So then he was asked to sit again. He had to sit and he did not get a treat. So it kind of goes it goes down on reinforcement, down on punishment, over with positive, over with negative. One way that I actually found was the easiest to understand operant behavior is through the ABCs of behavior. The A stands for antecedent, which is something that happens right before the behavior occurs. In a school, this might look like a teacher giving directions. The B stands for behavior, which is the actual action that the student takes, for example, raising their hand or calling out. And the C stands for consequence. This is what happens after the behavior. This could be a reward or a consequence like losing a privilege. So it just depends on what's happening, what situation you're in. The ABC model is important for teachers because it helps us figure out why the behavior is happening and how we can change it. We can either adjust the antecedent or we can adjust the consequence, and then in doing so, encourage positive behaviors and reducing negative ones. So just as contiguity and contingency work for classical conditioning, they also apply to operant conditioning. Contiguity refers to how quickly a consequence follows a behavior. So an example of this might look like a teacher giving praise immediately after a student answers a question. That behavior is then more likely to be repeated. If the consequence is delayed, the connection is weaker. So contingency refers to how consistently a consequence follows a behavior. If a student is only sometimes rewarded for raising their hand, they might get confused. But if the reward happens consistently, then the behavior will be learned more quickly. This means that in operant conditioning, behavior is the strongest when consequences are both immediate and consistent. This helps students to understand what's expected of them. Before we discuss which method is more effective, I just wanted to review some of the key differences between classical and operant conditioning. So classical focuses on learning through association between stimuli. It involves automatic involuntary responses and things that we don't consciously control, like emotions or reactions. While operant conditioning focuses on learning through consequences. It involves voluntary behaviors, which are things we choose to do. Behaviors are then strengthened through reinforcement or weakened through punishment. When we look at both operant and classical conditioning together, it's easy to compare the two and ask, which method is better. But I think that the real question should be which is more effective in each situation. Classical conditioning is going to be more effective for shaping emotional responses and associations. An example of this would be using classical conditioning to create a positive classroom environment where students consistently feel safe and comfortable. That way, they can learn effectively. Operant conditioning would be more effective in shaping behaviors. So teachers are able to use operant conditioning to encourage positive behaviors like participation and reduce negative behaviors through reinforcement and consequences. The reality of classical and operant conditioning is not that they are to be used separately, but that they are to simultaneously work together to support student learning. Classical conditioning can help students shape how they feel about the classroom, while operant conditioning will shape their behaviors in the classroom. If a student feels unsafe because of a negative association with their classroom, even strong reinforcement from operant conditioning might not be effective. On the other hand, if a student feels comfortable and supportive, then reinforcement might be a lot more effective. And here is my sources slide.